There is an invisible enemy that may be sabotaging your quest for an abundant life, and often we are not even aware of its presence. It does not appear in an obvious way, it does not scream for attention, but it is there, silently, undermining your achievements and distancing you from true fulfillment. Perhaps you have experienced moments of frustration where it seems that no matter how hard you try, something is always missing. The Bible teaches us that abundant life is not only found in material blessings, but in a harmony that involves our mind, body, and spirit. But what could be blocking you from achieving this peace and prosperity in all areas? This enemy infiltrates the heart in a subtle way, often without us realizing it, like an invisible poison that corrupts our attitudes, thoughts, and relationships. It may be preventing you from receiving the blessings that God has prepared for you, blocking your connection with the Creator. In Matthew 11 verse 29, Jesus invites us to learn from Him, who is meek and humble of heart. And it is in this humility that we find the secret to unlocking this life of fullness. But what happens when we allow the opposite of humility to take over our hearts? This obstacle, which most of us carry without even realizing it, could be the key that is blocking the flow of blessings in our lives. And the most intriguing thing is that the more it takes hold, the less we are able to see it in ourselves. It makes us believe that we are right, that we do not need help, and that we can go it alone. However, the Bible warns that this path leads to separation from God. And it is precisely this separation that makes the full life we seek so much always seem out of reach. Now, perhaps you are asking yourself, what obstacle is this? What is this enemy so subtle, yet so powerful, that could be blocking my abundant life? This sin is pride, silent, devastating, and it keeps you from the abundant life you seek so much, and what is more, it often goes unnoticed. Like bad breath, it is difficult to identify in yourself, but obvious to those around you. Although it is not easily recognized, it can create enormous barriers between you and God, limiting your ability to live fully. Proverbs 16 verse 5 warns us that the Lord detests everyone who is proud in heart, which reveals how seriously we must deal with this feeling. Pride manifests itself in many ways in our lives. It can appear in being when we believe that our intelligence, abilities, or beauty make us superior to others. It can appear in having when we judge our worth by what we own or what we have accumulated. And finally, it infiltrates being when we begin to feel superior because of the environments or social circles we frequent. In each of these expressions, pride distances us from the true humility that Jesus taught us. Matthew 11 verse 29 calls us to learn from Christ, who is gentle and humble in heart. The big problem with pride is that it makes us believe that we do not need anyone. Not God, not the people around us. This illusory self-sufficiency blocks God's grace in our lives. After all, how can we be receptive to God's blessings if we are convinced that we already have everything? Arrogance puts us on a dangerous path where our spiritual connection is weakened and the abundant life, which involves fullness of spirit, body, and mind, becomes unattainable. So, how can we recognize and combat pride? How can we free ourselves from this invisible prison that prevents the flow of God's blessings? Stay with me, because the answer to these questions can be the first step towards transforming your life. Pride not only affects our relationship with God, but it also destroys our relationships with the people around us. It leads us to live in constant competition, always comparing, judging, and criticizing others. A clear example of this in the Bible is the story of Cain and Abel. Driven by pride, Cain did not accept God's confrontation about his actions and, instead of correcting himself, He let his pride consume him to the point of taking the life of his own brother. This story illustrates how pride can poison our relationships, creating rivalries, envy, and deep resentment. When we allow pride to dominate our hearts, we lose the ability to learn from our mistakes. It makes us seek justifications for our failures, instead of humbly admitting them and growing from the lessons. Thus, we become trapped in a spiral of self-sufficiency that only distances us from the people we love. Pride prevents us from asking for forgiveness, from recognizing our limitations, and most importantly, from reconciling with those we have hurt. Philippians 2 verses 5 to 8 provides us with the most powerful example of how we should deal with pride. Jesus, being God, chose to humble himself, coming down to earth and becoming a servant. He emptied himself of all glory in order to teach us the true essence of humility. If Christ himself, who was without sin, chose the path of humility, how much more should we, imperfect and flawed, follow his example? Pride makes us believe that we are above others, but true harmony in relationships only comes when we strip ourselves of this arrogance and choose the path of service, compassion, and forgiveness. The key to transforming our relationships is to recognize pride when it arises and courageously face it. But how can we take this step toward humility? How can we actually practice what Jesus taught us? Humility is a virtue that is often misunderstood. It is not about thinking less of yourself, but about having a balanced and true view of who we are. True humility is being exactly who we are before God and others, without exaggeration, without pretense, without trying to make ourselves look better or worse. James 4 verse 6 reminds us that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This means that humility not only brings us closer to God, but it also makes room for Him to work more fully in our lives. When we are humble, we recognize our limitations and are willing to learn, grow, and repent when necessary. Humility frees us from the pressure to maintain an image of perfection that pride often imposes on us. And in this freedom, we find God's grace flowing abundantly. Unlike pride, which isolates us and blocks blessings, humility connects us with God and others in a sincere and profound way. To be humble is to have the courage to ask for help when we need it, to admit our faults, and to constantly seek improvement. This attitude opens doors for God to pour out His blessings on us, because He sees the sincerity of our hearts. Jesus taught us that the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the one who serves, and genuine service comes from a humble heart, willing to put the needs of others above one's own ego. Humility also transforms us into instruments of God, because by emptying ourselves of our pride, we allow the Holy Spirit to fill us with His wisdom and guidance. This power of humility leads us to a life of abundance, where we find peace, grace, and purpose. But how can we live this humility in a world that values pride and self-sufficiency so much? Jesus Christ is the greatest and most perfect example of humility that humanity has ever known. He, who had all the glory and power of heaven, chose to come down to earth and become like one of us. He not only came as a man, but took on the form of a servant, humbling himself to the point of death, even death on a cross, as Philippians 2 verse 8 tells us. This act of radical humility was not only a demonstration of love, but a profound teaching on how we should live. If Jesus, the Son of God, chose to come down, how much more do we, imperfect beings, need to learn to recognize our weaknesses and surrender to God's plan? The life of Jesus shows us that true greatness lies in humility and service. He washed the feet of His disciples, healed the sick, and most of all, sacrificed Himself for us. If we want to follow in His footsteps and live a life of abundance, We need to abandon pride and embrace meekness and humility. Pride often makes us think that we are self-sufficient, that we can solve everything on our own. But Christ teaches us the opposite. It is by humbling ourselves that we will be exalted. It is by recognizing our dependence on God that He can act fully in our lives. Christ invites us to let go of the need to control, to be first, to always be right. He calls us to a life where service to others and submission to God's will are the true paths to peace and abundance. If He, who was without sin, chose to humble Himself, how much more do we, full of flaws and imperfections, need to follow that path? When we choose to set aside pride and cultivate humility, the fruits of that decision begin to manifest clearly and powerfully in our lives. Psalm 101 verse 5 warns us that God will destroy the arrogant, but exalt the humble. This shows us that the path to exaltation and true abundance first passes through humility. By recognizing our dependence on God and positioning ourselves with a meek heart, we make room for Him to work more fully in our lives. One of the first fruits of humility is peace, not just peace with others, but also inner peace. The humble person does not carry the burden of comparison, competition, or the constant need to prove something. He knows that his strength and value come from God, and this brings him deep tranquility. Living in humility means being in harmony with others, knowing that true greatness lies in serving, not in exalting oneself. This state of peace and balance allows the abundant life promised by God to begin to flow naturally. Another fruit of humility is a more intimate communion with God. When we leave pride behind, we open our hearts to divine guidance. Humility makes us more receptive to God's will because we recognize that without Him, we can do nothing. This restored and strengthened relationship with the Creator is the foundation for living a full life, a life of abundance in all areas, whether in spirit, soul, or body. The abundant life is a life of fulfillment, and it is only possible when God is at the center. Pride corrodes us, distances us from others, and worse, distances us from God. But humility brings us closer, heals us, and transforms us. And as we learn to live in humility, we begin to experience an abundance that goes beyond the material, an abundance of purpose, love, and peace. If you truly want to experience an abundant life, the first step is to embrace humility. Pride and true abundance cannot coexist. When we look at the life of Jesus, we realize that walking with Him means following in His footsteps of gentleness and humility. The Bible teaches us that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble, James 4 verse 6. As we humble ourselves before God, we open the door for Him to work in every area of our lives, blessing us with His fullness and grace. Proverbs 21 verse 4 warns us that a haughty look and a proud heart are sin. This shows us that in order to live in tune with God's purpose, we must constantly guard our hearts, putting away pride and embracing humility. When we let go of pride, we begin to see things as they really are, and to understand that everything we have and everything we are comes from God. Christ invites us to walk alongside Him, with a humble heart, ready to serve and open to God's direction. If we truly desire to live in abundance, we need to let go of any sense of superiority or self-sufficiency, recognizing that it is God's grace that sustains and elevates us. At Roots of Wisdom, our goal is to always bring these roots of biblical wisdom, which connect us to God's true purpose for our lives. We want to inspire you to seek this internal transformation, starting with humility, so that you can experience the abundant life that God has promised. Leave pride behind and allow the Lord to fill your life with His grace and love. If this message touched your heart, Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue receiving inspiring content that will help you grow spiritually. God has a purpose for your life, and living in humility is the first step to discovering it.